Teresa?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining First Peoples Fund and myself in this really unprecedented time. It's an honor that you would tune in and listen to me present on this webinar on intellectual property. As Hillary said, I'm a member of the Penobscot Indian Nation. I'm also an artist, Penobscot basket maker from Maine, and I've been practicing my basketry for about 32 years. Last fall, I was really honored to be invited to participate in a one-week training program on intellectual property with about 24 Indigenous women entrepreneurs from all over the world. And this took place in Geneva, Switzerland at the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is a branch of the United Nations. And I have to say, I'm a beginner myself, but I realized from being a trainer for First Peoples Fund in the last 10 years, well, more like a dozen years, we really don't address intellectual property, and it is so important for contemporary artists and cultural practitioners to understand intellectual property and know what kind of tools are available to protect it for themselves and for their own communities. And this was what we were presented with when I was in Switzerland with the other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, was a basic understanding of intellectual property, and what are some of the tools that are available for us to protect the IP of not only just our own entrepreneurial or artistic or cultural practice, but also that of our communities, because many of us Indigenous communities, you naturally have intellectual property that belongs to the community as a whole. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but I do want to do that. Oh, and the third piece of that visit to Switzerland also had to do with a year-long mentoring program that I'm now in with the WIPO staff, World Intellectual Property Organization, to help me with my own project, which I'll talk about a little more as we go along in this 40-minute webinar. I think the other thing I wanted to say is I kind of feel like that commercial that's a little bit in the past now, but I don't have TV, but when I did, there's one for the Holiday Inn Express. And so, having been in Geneva for a week and, being familiarized with intellectual property, I'm not an expert, so there's that commercial on TV that says, oh, what makes you such an expert in this field? And people say, oh, I just spent a weekend in the Holiday Inn. So anyway, kind of good. I can't see your face. It's kind of a bad joke. But just to say that this is not meant to be comprehensive in the legal sense, but to be a beginner's guide in helping us begin to grapple with the terminology and some basic IP concepts, and to point you toward where there are some tools. And we hope at some point to be able to incorporate some of this information into our Native Artist Professional Development trainings, which I think a number of you would be familiar with. Okay, so let's get started then. As I said, the webinar is intended to help artists learn actually what intellectual property is and how you can protect your own and your community's intellectual property. And this is as expressed, and these are government terms, international government terms, but as IP as expressed through traditional knowledge, TK, traditional cultural knowledge, traditional cultural expression, TCE, and traditional ecological knowledge, which we're not going to have to know these terms, and those are international terms, but more to say that IP has to do with knowledge, cultural expression, which could be art, it could be ceremony, and then there's really important ecological knowledge that our, especially cultural practitioners in our communities know, that really should be protected and not shared with the general public. So the IP presented in this photo belongs to the artist, Anna Brown Eilers on the right. This is a Community Spirit Award recipient with First Peoples Fund. She's also a United States artist. And and the IP also belongs to her Tlingit community. And this is Anna with her, sadly, I believe, her late daughter. And so you could see the traditional cultural expression of the killer whale, for example, on the left, and then You know, this would be Anna's creation, her intellectual property, but also imagining that the designs in this have been handed down for generations and belong to the Tlingit community that she's from as well, you know. So thinking about intellectual property as not just and as individual, but also as community IP. And this is very different, I will say, that the cultural practitioners and the women entrepreneurs, indigenous women entrepreneurs, brought to Geneva, in that they're used to, you know, in this world office at, you know, affiliated with the United Nations in Geneva and Switzerland, they're used to dealing with huge corporate intellectual property issues. And we have brought this perspective to say, you know, we have cultural responsibilities and community responsibilities as Indigenous practitioners, and we need to protect that IP as well. And so it was very interesting. And part of the reason we were there was not just to quote unquote receive training, but to provide input and help this World Intellectual Property Organization develop their own materials and their own tools to begin to address the needs in Indigenous communities. Of course, you know, we're kind of often, you know, the last to be considered in this kind of work. So again, I use the word traditional in the TK, TCE, and TEK, and not to think that this is just about traditional art and culture bearers, but also contemporary art, as you'll see. So Indigenous peoples, you know, we have the right to maintain, control, and protect and develop our own cultural heritage, our traditional knowledge, and our traditional cultural expression. So intellectual property protection is your right. So the Declaration talks about protecting manifestations of sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of flora and fauna, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports and traditional games, visual and performing arts, just to name a few. This is a Clarissa Rizal art. And again, another Tlingit artist who wove this raven's tail cloak, and this will come up later in an example of cultural misappropriation that I'm going to share. And this photo belongs to her as well. And so that's another thing too, I'm bringing to the First Peoples Fund practice, and we've tried to do this as much as possible anyway, and try to acknowledge where are the photos coming from that we use in our work, who are the artists, how are they acknowledged, who is the, you know, the photographer of such work. Okay, so this is like a really, you know, busy and full slide, and I don't like these kind of slides, but I didn't know how to make it smaller. And what I want to share with you is that this is an introduction to some of the terminology you'll recognize, of course, brands. I talked to you about community cultural expression. For me and my community, a big community cultural expression or traditional cultural expression for us is our basketry. Ash and traditional ash and sweetgrass basketry of the Penobscot Nation and the Wabanaki peoples. Copyright is a term that's familiar, but I'll speak about it in the context of IP so that we understand, you know, how we're using it here. Cultural appropriation, or as I said, the Europeans use the term cultural misappropriation, which is probably more accurate. IP, intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to go into some of these through this webinar, but not in, you know, so much detail with everything. And so I will assure you that this webinar and the slides and the presenter's notes that I'm presenting will be accessible in our resource toolkit on the First Peoples Fund website. And Hillary will provide that information, as she said. This is a photograph of First Peoples Fund Community Spirit Award recipient, fellow David Boxley. And I realized I didn't, you know, fully research and attribute the artist who made the art that I believe he made the drum, but the hat is probably woven by someone in his community. I believe that's a Terry Rothkar cloak that he's wearing. So again, even myself having to be reminded, and the photo actually belongs to Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. So, you know, just trying to think about that and begin to realize that, you know, intellectual property is all around us and needs to be protected. And we as artists need to protect other artists' intellectual property and acknowledge that. So again, this is even busier, and I don't want to take the time, but these are, you know, definitions from the prior page. And so, and we can talk about this in the questions section too. And the definitions, and I'm providing some really good links here in this webinar, the definitions are from, of course, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the leading authority in the world, you know, on intellectual property. And then there's some other links down at the bottom, so you'll see that when you get this information. Okay, so backing up, just kind of who, what, and why should we be protecting IP? And so basically, all Indigenous artists need to be aware of what their intellectual property is: contemporary, performing, recording, culture bearers, visual artists, and then, you know, as I stressed earlier, entire Indigenous communities. What is intellectual property? And this is, again, kind of a basic definition given by the World Intellectual Property Organization. And, you know, just thanks for bearing with me on some of these definitions, but refers to the creation of the mind. Literary and artistic works are included, designs and symbols, names and images used in culture and commerce. And the big thing is why on the bottom, because I thought, well, you know, companies do this as well, but for us, this is what makes us different too as Indigenous people and Indigenous entrepreneurs, to keep our designs and cultural and traditional knowledge intact. And of course, we want to protect our financial commercial interests. So, you know, not having other people rip us off, in other words, you know, and being able to realize our own financial return and protection of our own, you know, designs and artwork. So we'll start to get into some examples and again, some more definitions. I'm sorry. This is Keone Nunez, and he's also a First Peoples Fund Community Spirit Award recipient. And so here, there's a few things going on in this slide that we should talk about for, you know, copyright and trademark. So first of all, you see First Peoples Fund Turtle, and most of you are familiar with that. And that's our trademark. That's part of our intellectual property, you know, as an organization. And I believe it is copyrighted. Trademarks and logos help you identify your brand. Copyright is basically how you legally protect your trademark or your logo, but they don't necessarily, trademarks and logos don't necessarily have to be formally legally copyrighted to be protected. For example, Keone's work here, you know, his tattoo, you know, body work is basically his own designs. And I think some of that is his community cultural intellectual property. And because it's been used, you know, in perpetuity, and because, you know, they can document that, that has automatic protection. You know, so even our turtle does for First Peoples Fund. We've been using this, you know, for a good 20 years or more. And because of its use and it's unique and it's a unique identifier for us, First Peoples Fund, that is automatically protected and copyrighted without having to pay for some kind of copyright little C in the corner there. So that's what a lot of people don't understand. And that was one of the first big lessons I learned, that if your art and your logo and designs are unique and distinguishing identifiers for you as your trademark, as your logo, then they do have automatic protection. And I do have a link, which is again in the presenter's note, on more information on trademarks and how to create a strong mark for yourself. And this is part of my project too, is for my basketry. I'm working with this mentor, and we're, you know, working on creating a strong logo and a trademark for my art business. So I think that's that. Okay, this is a photograph of my great-grandmother. And it's kind of, again, a few things going on here, lessons we can talk about for photo use and credit and ownership. You know, I felt like my family owned this photo because this is our great-grandmother, and she probably wasn't even asked her permission. You know, she was selling her baskets here on the Penobscot Indian Reservation in 1953. on Indian Island in Old Town, Maine. And the photographer actually owns the credit and use of this photograph. So I'm even using it illegally right now, just to make an example. And I've been using it, for those of you who know me, for like 20 years. So in the United States, we're supposed to seek permission for use of a photo if we can find the photographer and, you know, and or their family, and if we know their name, we're supposed to cite it. And so in this case, we don't know who the photographer was. We don't know the name of the photographer. And so I'm, you know, kind of getting away with it. In Europe, I think it's 50 years, but in the United States, it's like 70 years. So we have a lot of historic photos from my community of basket making and basket makers. And this is kind of shaping exhibition I'm going to be working on for part of my IP with the local museum, that I need to be careful about photo use. And so I just share that with you. Also, I'm showing this photograph because my project with World Intellectual Property Organization is to try to document some of these family weaves. I weave baskets using the same wooden forms and some of the same tools that have been handed down to me from my great-grandma. And so my baskets look very much like hers. Well, I think she would be proud and she would give me permission. But my point is that I'm trying to document like what types of weaves and styles are unique to my tribe, the Penobscot Nation. There are 4 basketry tribes in the state I live in Maine, federally recognized Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot people. And so our work is all a little bit distinct from each other. There's a lot of overlap. And so part of my project is documenting what are the weaves that were handed down to me through my family. You know, what is the historical cultural knowledge of that? And some of that I know, you know, through being handed down this tradition, but also doing it through photographs and some historical documentation. This is my friend Kara Romero, who's a photographer. And I guess I'm just trying to show you too, some of the complexity and some of the extensive issues that can come into play here. Not to, you know, think about this IP as intimidating at all, but there's so many aspects, and I think tools, you know, for us to think about to protect our own IP. So Kara's a photographer, and these are her photographs. Like, so this is her intellectual property, but yet at the same time, you see this young boy in her Chemehuevi community is wearing his own, you know, their traditional garb. And I'm sorry you can't see the rest of his regalia, but that would be intellectual property that belongs to that California tribal community as well. And then in the lower corner, Kara is married to someone from the Santa Clara Pueblo. And so you can see the ceremonial dress, such a cool picture, but you know, outside of that, you can see that someone is wearing, you know, ceremonial dress and clothing of the Santa Clara Pueblo. And so those designs and that clothing, you know, and that regalia and their dances, of course, belong to that community. In fact, I wanted to share that I was at the Santa Clara Pueblo community last year during Indian Market. So honored to be invited to the feast day in August. And I witnessed, and there were signs everywhere about it, but I witnessed the tribal constables grabbing a camera, an iPhone from a woman who was, you know, so not supposed to be photographing or filming these very, very spiritual ceremonial dances that they were conducting. And even though they're the Santa Clara Pueblo, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of dancers are open to the public. You know, there's absolutely strictly forbidden. So, I mean, they're protecting their intellectual property. And I thought that was awesome. And but this woman was completely freaked out. And I think she got a $350 ticket. And I think she talked her way into getting her phone back, but they really weren't, I think, even going to give it back to her until after the weekend. So, you know, there's an example of a tribal community, you know, seriously involved in protecting the intellectual property of their community. And so back to Kara's photography, you know, she'll have art photo exhibitions in museums. And this is when then she'll be also not just the artist, the photographer, but she'll also be the curator. And the curator of an exhibition, you know, the person who organizes the exhibit in the museum will also have intellectual property rights to the theme of the exhibition. like the exhibition that I have coming up is going to have to do with Native women entrepreneurs over 200 years in our Baskettu tribes here, because like I said, there's a lot of documented information. I'm studying a basketry collection that encompasses just about 200 years of baskets with all these amazing weaves and things. And I'm not going to be happy if someone else uses that theme and that title in this quote unquote bicentennial year that we're here in Maine. And so, you know, remembering even that when you're working with museums, and again, the World Intellectual Property Organization has a manual that you can download that can help you understand your rights as you work with a museum to your own intellectual property as a person who curates a museum exhibition. So I'm sharing this just to say that, you know, IP can be extensive and complicated, but it's also, you know, really important. And even the community, again, has rights in the IP. So now we're getting into, which a lot of you are familiar with, I'm sure, you know, cultural appropriation, or better known as cultural misappropriation. And a lot is going around on social media. And so I'll show you some examples that I've seen that have to do with First Peoples Fund Fellows and help me to, you know, make a little point or whatever. So this is Beverly Bear King Moran's traditional Plains women dress on the left-hand side. And this is where a company totally copied, stole a photograph probably of hers from her Facebook, or, you know, probably off the web somewhere, and made it into a t-shirt. And this is unbelievable, you know, but yet you can see how easily it was done. So I don't even know if this company is still in existence. Many, you guys could probably be Googling this while you're, you know, listening to me, but there isn't much to be done about things like this. You know, social media shaming, I think, works. And this is where this came to light for me. And this company, I've heard, is in the Philippines. And I'm not sure, I don't know anything really about how far this went, even with my friend Beverly. But, you know, it's replicating her art on t-shirts at a direct and complete total ripoff. I mean, I don't have to say much more about that, in t-shirts and hoodies. And, so this is happening out there a lot in the fashion world. And again, those of you, you know, who are in this world know this. I don't even have to tell you. So this is stolen intellectual property and copyright infringement. But when I talked to an intellectual property lawyer about this, and I brought up this example when I was in Switzerland, I showed this slide in my own little presentation. I basically was told that in the United States, in our country, an intellectual property lawsuit is going to cost you about $1 million, and that's no joke. And so, again, you know, this field has been populated by corporations and corporate issues over the last, you know, 80 years or something. And so something has to change. And I think in our world, and the Indigenous women entrepreneurs I met, I think probably about 5 of them, so almost 20% of us, in that group, and our ages spanned from 25 to 70, had lawsuits going, and they were pro bono lawsuits by lawyers in their countries. One was in Australia, one was Papua New Guinea. And so I think that's the way to go, obviously, is to try to figure out how to get your own pro bono lawyer, which a lot of people are anxious to do, especially, you know, the more experienced older ones. And I guess, I presume for them, it's a tax write-off. But back to Beverly's thing here too, and some of the other examples I'm going to show, I think it's mostly dealt with through social media shaming, as, you know, what I've seen other artists do. I think Lauren Goodday-Giago was one of the first examples I saw. I'm sorry, that's not her last name anymore. Lauren Goodday, great First Peoples Fund Fellow, trainer, and designer and Plains artist. She had somebody directly rip off her earrings. Her designs, her women ledger figures were showing up on someone's earring. She went right to that person on Facebook and said, hey, what do you think you're doing? You know, this is my art, these are my designs, this is my intellectual property. And so I think that can be effective, but it's tough. You know, I just don't think there's enough law and enforcement out there now to protect us. So I guess that's what I'm sharing, is that's kind of, you know, the bad news of it all. Here's another example, and this is, many of you know United States artist Nicholas Galanin, and I won't attempt his Indian name. Again, I'm using, I don't know why all this Tlingit art examples pop up. And so, but I like the way he put it too. He totally calls out the Italian fashion house that stole the late Clarissa Rizal's robe and is basically selling it through Neiman Marcus. I mean, it's unbelievable. And last time I checked in February, this is still for sale for around $2,500, and even using the name. And so again, him calling them out for, you know, ceremony and cultural and intellectual property. So just kind of unbelievable. But I don't know how effective that was. A couple of more examples. Again, another First Peoples Fund fellow, Dana Tiger, Community Spirit Award recipient. Her warrior women art shows up again, once again, on t-shirts, and that's not even the same website, unfortunately. And she called it out on her page. And then I love this one on the right, Jamie Akuma, who's I mean, she now has, I think it's a 27,000 followers when I copied this photo a couple years ago. She has like 44,000 followers now. And so again, she's trying to make a difference, and it actually showed up on the Huffington Post website, where, you know, she's saying, oh my God, like these are beautiful, antique, probably ceremonial moccasins, Lakota moccasins that are being appropriated and sold by Bergdorf Goodman. And again, these high end retailers as well. So I like the way she is. So enough said on that. You can read her comments. Okay. This is an interesting example of the opposite of cultural misappropriation. It's called creative collaboration, is what I'm terming it. But I will have to say, this story of the Sami people becoming fully full partners on the production of their cultural aspects and their intellectual property in the inclusion of Frozen 2 was something that they had to initiate, the Sami people of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It was not going to happen without them intervening. So this is a screen share, a Skyping session that we had in Geneva, Switzerland, with the director of the Sami Parliament, Rune Fiendhorn, I think his name is, and it was very cool. So this had just happened last fall, where the Sami people, of which, you know, probably number maybe 100,000 total. I know the figure, but I've forgotten of. So these are the indigenous people of Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And I'll tell the story the director told to us, but the director basically said that, you know, Frozen 1 was made. And the Sami people of these 3 European countries at the Arctic Circle said, hey, you know, to Disney, they wrote them a letter a couple of years ago and said, hey, we noticed that you've been here before. In other words, you know, very polite European way. And they also said to Disney, in this just simple, like, one-page letter, which was shared with us, you know, we have worked really hard over the last 100 years to save ourselves, basically to save our culture and our intellectual property, you know, and you're using designs and music and things that we do in our culture, you know, culturally appropriating some of our things. And we want to talk to you about it because we heard you're coming back. We heard that you're planning Frozen 2. And so the funny thing was that they didn't hear back. And this was really interesting too, because they wrote basically a letter by mail, you know, not using modern technology. And they heard back, and about 5 months later, and one person from Disney basically said, oh yeah, sure. Who's your point person? And we'll be in touch. And the Sami people wrote back and said, oh no. You know, we are people from 3 different parliaments, from 3 different countries, and we're going to need to meet, and we're going to need to talk, and we're going to need to visit. And so they brought them over actually and met in these incredible, you know, traditional yurts that the Sami people use still, and had ceremony and had, you know, cleansing saunas and things with these Disney, and so it turned into this, it turned into a good thing, but it took quite an effort, and, you know, really remarkably, turned out remarkably well. So the photo I just showed too is part of the very first understanding, was that whatever movie is made will be made in our language for our own people and for our own children. And then on from there. So a lot of the clothing and things and designs, I don't know how much into detail to go, but, and I think I don't have a lot of the detail here, but this is kind of like a glorified agreement, sharing what some of the terms of the agreement were, what kinds of things would be shared. And I do think there was a monetary settlement as well. But the most important thing was that Sami said, you know, we need to be in control of how we're portrayed here, because we worked so hard to share who we are and protect who we are as Indigenous people. And you should not be portraying us, you know, without our input, you know, at the very least. So moving on, that was really cool to be a part of that during our training, and that all that whole agreement was happening. Some of you may be familiar with Eighth Generation's website, and our fellow First Peoples Fund fellow, Louis Gong. And he was kind of the first one who did something about this. You know, in other words, he was noticing a lot of people, and people still do, and I'm not saying anything critical about it, buying, you know, Pendleton blankets, and Pendleton has always said, yeah, you know, we're Native inspired. And Louis, you know, was tired of hearing that and said, you know, I want to support and start a business, which he did, that supports inspired natives. So real inspired Native artists, not, you know, to see us buying these blankets, you know, that are made by Pendleton. And so this is an example of one of our other fellows, Artist and Business Leadership fellows, John Isaiah Pepion, who's Piikani Blackfeet from Montana, and I just love this piece. And so this is his blanket in collaboration with another fellow, Louis Gong. And so that's one of the beauties too of the First Peoples Fund work and the fellows and being like kind of in our community, is that, you know, this working together. And so again, this is another example of cultural collaboration. And I guess, you know, sovereignty, you know, showing Indigenous sovereignty through economic, through intellectual property. So this is the WIPO that I mentioned, and there's some great articles. I think, Ben, you turned me on to this one, Curbing Cultural Appropriation in the Fashion Industry with Intellectual Property, and that's a big one. Like I said, this is where you're seeing, and you know, you're all familiar with, I think Urban Outfit is using, I think it was Navajo designs like 5 years back. It was kind of the beginning of this, you know, on their underwear, for crying out loud. And then like, you know, the Victoria's Secret models wearing, you know, headdresses. And so it's been going on for a while. And so there's an article that talks about that and some examples. And then again, a number of resources available through the World Intellectual Property Organization. And hopefully you'll be able to access those and start learning more about it. And I do think that documentation is key to everything, you know, and this was quite a topic of discussion for a whole day out of the 5 days that we met about this. And we had our training in Switzerland, is if you can show, you know, and document. Unfortunately, a burden is upon us to show like what particular intellectual property belongs to you and your art or your cultural community, then you're going to have an easier time protecting it. Another example of creative collaboration, not appropriation. This is the Canada Goose Company, which some of you may be familiar with up here where I live. A lot of people are wearing these goose down coats, but those ones are super expensive, the ones, you know, that are the puffy ones. But this is the same company out of Canada that has actually collaborated with Inuit artists to make a new kind of authentic, one-of-a-kind handcrafted jackets and native design. So another example of the IP of a community being respected and protected, and artists actually benefiting from the direct sales. So I'm not saying you have to do everything, everything by yourself. You know, there can be examples too And Canada is kind of ahead of us on this. You know, there's some resources there, there's some pages, articles. So I was just, you know, kind of cutting and pasting these together, and you can go and read different examples and different papers on, you know, kind of call to action too on what people and what Canadian artists are doing. You know, this is you know, I hate to say it's a university out of Canada, and I'm sorry to say I don't know who did this, but this is a really good guide. And it's not just for people, you know, who might be prone to misappropriating, but it's also for us, you know, for creators and artists and designers to learn more about, you know, Indigenous cultural property. And so I'm sorry, I know it's a university in Canada, but I don't have the actual source, but it's in that link there to the left. And again, you're going to have access to all these slides afterwards. That's a 2016 publication, so things, you know, things are changing already probably. Okay, so for me, you know, of course I'm in this project and in this work and starting to learn more myself. So what am I doing? And one of the first things I mentioned to you, I am working on kind of a better logo. I had something, I don't think it's that great. And so I want to do my own branding, you know, create my own logo or trademark and then copyright it. I use watermarks now in my photos. I came home and immediately started doing that because at least then I can see, is someone using my photo? I mean, I do use Instagram and Facebook to sell my art sometimes. And so I can see someone using my photo to, you know, without my permission. That's basically all it's going to do for you. Somebody could erase that, you know, take my name off, and then I'll clearly know they're using it without my permission. So I developed this little heirloom woven corn series. Well, a lot of us weave corn, but these are kind of like, I think I'm like the first one to call it, you know, this Hopi blue, this callus flint corn. These are like these ancient indigenous heirloom series that I'm weaving. And so I'm trying to say, like, this is kind of something I developed along this line, and we'll see how that goes. I will point out too, though, that we were very effective, and I've been associated with the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, an organization that I helped found 25 years ago. And we're very effective with having our own logo and trademark. And this we developed almost on day one in 1993. The Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance is a consortium of the 4 weaving tribes in Maine, about 150 weavers. And this was a hang tag and a certification on every single basket that we sold. So someone would know not only that we were a member of this alliance, but also that you were certified to be a member of one of the 4 federally recognized tribes, which for us at the time was very important. I don't go into why maybe that isn't so important anymore, but also we wouldn't use the name Maine anymore, you know, that's kind of dated. I think we call ourselves Wabanaki, which we always have. And so we'd probably say something like Wabanaki Basket Weavers Association or something now, or Alliance. So this is my website. And like a lot of artists, I'm behind, it's a little dated. I made it myself with WordPress, and that's actually not my logo, but that is my business name, Wikipede Baskets. And so you can see there's a funny little stock inventory picture that I picked, you know, to put beside there. And so that's still not my logo or trademark. But I did want to point this out and show this. I own the domain names. I bought them. WabanakiBaskets.com and TeresaSecord.com. And I still think that's good advice. If you have a business name and or you have a, you know, try to buy your own name.com, because a lot of artists do use their own name in association with their website. It's either my friend Jeremy Frey Baskets.com. You know, so it's weird to think about, but someone else will buy that if they think, like, I'm not famous like he is, but, you know, somebody would buy that to try to direct. In fact, someone who's kind of a friend of mine, I was surprised, bought WabanakiBaskets.com, and it takes you right to his retail store in Southern Maine. And he's not even native, but he's selling, you know, baskets. He works with artists. I don't know how I feel about that, because I was thinking at some point, as a collective, as a community organization, we might, the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance might want that name. And so maybe we'd approach him and say, hey, you know, that should go to our website, or, you know, that should belong to us. So just think about that in terms of intellectual property. And I pay and maintain these domain names. every year. And again, that is my longtime business name too, Wikipede Basket. So if you type either one of those in, it goes to my 10-year-old website. And I don't mean to be joking, but like so many artists, we have so many things going on. Okay, so there's that inside of that hang tag I was showing you earlier. And unfortunately, we don't really use that anymore. So one of my things on my project is to think about, you know, working with the other basket makers and saying, look, this is at least, and I think that falls under one of the terms I talked about earlier, geographic indicators. Because geographically, there are people from the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation in New York who make similar baskets, but geographically ours are pretty distinct here, the Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Wabanaki baskets. And so we might want to think about a collective name, but enough of that. So you can see where kind of the Tlingit and Haidas have done this. Of course, a lot of people know about the Silver Hand Project from Alaska. And these are, and then even at the bottom there, you know, used to be native jewelry hallmarks. So people could protect their intellectual property and also at the same time certify to the buyer, you know, that their work was their work. Let's see, legal resources. You know, as I said, God forbid you have to hire a real, you know, lawyer who won't do pro bono work or something, because I don't know how people are going to afford it. But there are some cases that I mentioned at Native American Rights Fund. And then Leonard Duboff, who's a lawyer for First Peoples Fund, might be able to refer you to other people. He is an expert himself in intellectual property, copyright, trademark. I'm not, you know, recommending him. It's not my job to send us to lawyers or anything. But another interesting link at the bottom here is the Department of Interior, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. So this is kind of some overlap here with intellectual property and what we're talking about. And so many of you know in the 1990s, I forget what actual year, but public law, maybe 1990, it was in 1991, when the Indian Arts and Crafts Act basically said that people will not, it'll be considered consumer fraud if people, you know, advertise their art as Native American and it's not, or if you pretend to be a Native American yourself and you're selling art, you know, those kinds of things are violations. So the reason why I'm kind of saying it like this too is because many of us know that really didn't have a lot of enforcement behind it, but they are starting to build cases now these years later, and there is a place to report a potential violation. And so again, this is an overlap here with the topic we're talking about, intellectual property, and that, you know, you could also try this route to report, you know, some kind of intellectual property violation. And these are the actual people who nominated me to go to Switzerland. And so I feel like if you already do have something that's happening, it would be really important for you to reach out to the U.S. Department of Interior, Indian Arts and Crafts Board. And I can share, if people want to email me too through First Peoples Fund, or I'll give my email at the end. You can always do it that way. Okay, some lights are blinking, and so I don't know if I've gone over, but so for more information, I put up the Native Arts Professional Development slide with First Peoples Fund, because many of you know, we conduct professional development trainings, 2-day trainings for artists, and so we're available to do this for tribes, you know, for fee for service, or if you're one of the, you know, grant interest areas we're working in, you know, we can make some of this available for training. But as Hillary said, this will be on our website, these slides. And so I think with that, I should probably stop and open things up for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Teresa. That was wonderful. Currently, I just have one question that was in the chat box, and it was from Celeste. It says, with performing artists, photographers often take photos of the artist without permission. Does this artist have any recourse if the photographer is using those photos for profit? Or is there an assumption that because the artist is a public figure, that they don't have any resource?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think as a standard, right, yeah, I did gather that. Sure. I think as a matter of practice, most photographers and, you know, videographers are, you know, people, you know, filming are subject to, having permission, or I believe they're supposed to have gotten permission from a performer or, a recording artist to use that material. And so I would assume that's some kind of infringement on your intellectual property if your photo especially, or your music or your art is being used without your permission. Yeah, I believe that would be a violation.
It's a difficult one because artists or performing artists are out in public all the time, and I'm wondering if there's an assumption, a legal assumption, that because you're putting yourself on a stage, that you're giving up that right. And this is a question that I've pursued a lot. Carrie Morin, who's a First Peoples Fund fellow.
That sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, and I manage him, and his image has been used to actually earn money for, it's a nonprofit, but nonetheless they put out some coffee table books with his images in them without his permission. And I know that the most recent one, the first edition, sold for $15,000.
What? Yeah, no, I don't believe that they have permission to do that. And I think maybe someone like Wade Fernandez, or Frank Wall, or Frank, Wall too, because no, from my understanding from, again, this is just like a beginner's workshop that I was in, but that, the use happens at the time of the performance, in that people are invited to enjoy and appreciate, but that any use beyond that has to be given, that permission has to be given for use of the music or the photographs or the images. Yeah, that during the half-hour performance, yeah, people can sit and enjoy that and everything. But once you start using that image beyond the actual half-hour or hour performance, then that's an infringement of his intellectual property.
I've seen,
but again, the enforcement is where I'm afraid to say,
it's tough. I've seen Frank Wallen's image misappropriated also.
Right.
And I brought that to his attention. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I don't know, where the protection is either, because, and this is what we were saying as Indigenous practitioners and Indigenous entrepreneurs in Switzerland, is where do we go? Like, we're not a corporation with $1 million in the bank. Like, who is going to look out for art? And so, unfortunately, that's a government organization, this WIPO. And so the wheels are going to grind kind of slowly there. But I think that's what they're going to try to solve, is where are there going to be some tools and resources and hopefully free legal help for Indigenous people? Because we could just think of some of the egregious things. I mean, that was a very happy story with Frozen 2, but there's some, horrific, egregious things happening to Indigenous people all over the world. And, having to do with intellectual property. And I'm sorry to hear about this one too. And I don't know if you tried to talk to a lawyer or try to seek out any consultation on that one.
Because we just really can't, as you say, afford that because it's so expensive. But I do lots of professional development as a manager agent on my own. And I'm always asking that question wherever I can from whatever expert is in the room. And it's a fuzzy area. I have never gotten a solid answer to that question.
One thing I want to offer to Hillary, if you would please share my email address with all of the people on the webinar today, because if I can connect you with someone at WIPO after they're up and running again, unfortunately, Switzerland has one of the highest per capita occurrences of COVID-19 as we speak. And so they're in serious quarantine, but after they, the UN and those organizations, NGOs open up again, hopefully I can connect you with someone there, because at least they do have experts from all over the world in this work. And I can't imagine they haven't dealt with this before. And I'd be really happy to connect you, Celeste, especially because this has to do with an Indigenous entrepreneur.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you could share my email, Hillary, I'd love that.
Teresa, do you feel comfortable with me sharing it in the chat box right now?
Of course,
Okay,
of
I'll
course.
do that right now, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. That's a really good question. And I think I go back to that Holiday Inn Express. I wish I was an attorney in some ways. Not. Anybody else have any questions or comments or?
Feel free to unmute yourself, everybody, if you have a question.
Hi, Teresa. This is Ben.
Hi, Ben.
I have a question that has to do with the development of laws and regulations protecting intellectual property. And I know that I think that WIPO has tried to influence countries to develop laws and regulations. Did they talk about that when you were in Switzerland?
You know, I think they referred to it, but I don't have any recollection of, because I think their work with indigenous communities is the work that they really are trying to embark on. I think that's what's underway now. Is that what you're referring to, as the work for rules and laws,
Yes.
helping into, yeah, it seemed to me like it's in its infancy and they're still kind of gathering data.
Yeah.
And they have some documents and things that they shared with us, on how to protect your IP and things like that, but in terms of actually helping nations put things into law yet, I didn't receive any information on that.
Okay.
I wish. And I think that's the only thing I'd say is, like, it sounded like help is coming, but again, the wheels don't grind that fast there, is what I understood either. And so it's like, yeah, but what about now? All the cultural misappropriation that's happening, and things are happening, especially because of social media, so fast. Where you saw Beverly Bear King Moran's beautiful plains women's dress on a t-shirt, for crying out loud. That was disgusting.
It's a shame that we have to resort to shaming on social media. If we see an egregious case of theft on
Right.
Facebook, our only resort seems to be just trying to shame the people who are doing that theft.
Yeah, I feel like that the government, Department of Interior, the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, I think I share, frustration with a lot of people that doesn't have more enforcement capability. And, as I understand, the staff there, it's only a couple of people like Susan Porian and Ken Van Way, so it's not hardly like it's anyone's fault, but like our own Interior Department, still can barely like give support, to people where clearly, someone's representing art being sold as Native American. It's not. Like, I thought there was a big one with turquoise jewelry from the Philippines. That was, I think, one of their cases that they went after and helped, prosecute. But I was with a friend of mine during Santa Fe Indian Market, was it last summer? Not last summer, the summer before, when the Hilton Hotel was, one of the ballrooms was full of turquoise and turquoise and silver jewelry. And there's no way that it was Native American. It couldn't even possibly be. There was way too much of it. And it was myself and another basket maker artist. And now I'm thinking, after hearing about that Philippines case, that it possibly was from there. And that's maybe why we didn't see them in 2019. But it was an entire ballroom filled of cases and cases of jewelry. And we were just perplexed by it. So I think that's been going on quite a while with turquoise and silver jewelry, actually. Okay, well, the thing I want to say too, as I continue to learn and, we'll continue to update this webinar. I've worked on a couple of other webinars that now are a year old at First Peoples Fund. One is, and one might be appropriate for people today, but some of the deadlines are outdated, but it talks about funding your art as Native artists. So how to write grants, how to look for ways to, fund your own art business, that's a good webinar that's there, but I need to update it. And I do expect that I'll be updating this one as well, as information becomes available, and hopefully, sharing more examples and hopefully some success stories too. So I want to thank everyone once again, and really appreciate and hope everyone stays safe and healthy.
Great job, Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. This was very helpful.
Great. Thanks for the input. And feel free to stay in touch. I'm kind of like that anyway. If people want to email me, and I'm like a connector, and I'm also on Facebook. Feel free to friend me on Facebook. If I can help in any way, I will.
Good job.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Stan.
And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I just added my email address to the chat box as well. So if you need any FPF resources or wanting to know more about our Native Arts professional development trainings, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always an email away.
Okay, I'm signing off. Thanks again, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We always appreciate your subject matter expertise. Thank you again.
Always learning. Take care. Bye.